Welcome to the PDB Situation Report. I'm Mike Baker, your eyes and ears on the world stage. All right, let's get briefed. Today, we begin in Israel, where a breakthrough might just be on the horizon, a hostage and ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. We'll get the latest from Jonathan Schanzer. He's the executive director of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And later in the program, we'll review how the war in Ukraine has progressed throughout its third year. That's right, a third year. Examining the major events of 2024 and what 2025 just might hold. Open source intelligence analyst and friend of the show, Ryan McBeth, will join us to break it down. But first, today's Situation Report Spotlight. Now, after months of stalemates, after back and forths and failed efforts, Israel and Hamas might finally be nearing a ceasefire to end the ongoing 14-month war. Officials are urging caution, as they should, as critical details still need to be hammered out. However, there is a renewed sense of optimism, which frankly has been absent for quite some time. Reports from Egyptian and Hamas sources indicate the potential deal would roll out in phases. It includes a cessation of hostilities, the exchange of Israeli hostages for Palestinian prisoners, and an increase in humanitarian aid to Gaza. Now, Israel estimates that Hamas is holding some 100 hostages, though tragically, over one-third of them are believed to have been killed. This possible agreement may mark a turning point in a conflict that has destabilized the region and been devastating for the Palestinians and Israeli people alike. For more on this, let me bring in Jonathan Schanzer. He's the executive director of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Jonathan, thanks very much for taking the time to join us here on the Situation Report.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
Excellent. Well, let's start with a very big question. It's sort of at the 30,000-foot level, and then we can drill down from there. But what do you think accounts for the apparent progress with the ceasefire negotiations right now?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think, number one, Israel's winning. And you can see it across all of the domains where Israel's been fighting. I mean, Hamas is on its last leg, 23 out of 24 brigades destroyed, really virtually no military infrastructure above ground to speak of. The Israelis are slowly and methodically moving through those tunnels, mapping them and destroying them after they make sure that there are no hostages there. So that's working out, I think, pretty well from the Israeli perspective. They also have built this, it's called the Netzarim corridor. It's this new, essentially elongated base that cuts across, I guess, around 2/3 of the way up Gaza. You see this large corridor now, a major base. And so the Israelis have a semi-permanent structure there that is maintaining control over Gaza. Hamas just cannot compete at this point. They've been really knocked for a loop. But then you've got the weakening of Hezbollah in the north, these are, of course, Hamas's longtime allies. They've just agreed to raise the white flag. They don't want to fight Israel any longer because the Israelis just beat them up pretty good, too. Their leadership has been utterly gutted. And on top of that, the Israelis have destroyed a vast amount of their military infrastructure. And so that's all good. And then on top of that, you see the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria. And the Israelis also took out that the air defenses of Iran back in late October. They've taken out the ballistic missile production facilities. There's really nothing left right now of that support structure that Hamas once had. And that means that the Israelis have the upper hand. And then on top of that, you got Donald Trump coming in saying, I want this war over before January 20th, or there's going to be hell to pay. I think that's got everybody quaking in their boots. So I think right now momentum is shifting toward the end of the war. That's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is a good thing. But to what degree does a ceasefire, regardless of whether it's temporary or, I mean, I hate to use the word permanent when we're talking about anything related to the Middle East, but to what degree does that give Hamas and Iran the opportunity to rebuild?
You're always going to have that moment where, the guns fall silent and then they start to think about how they're going to do this again. I think there's a couple things to watch. One is the Israelis are not leaving what's known as the Philadelphia corridor. This is the area between the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. The Israelis know that that's where the vast majority of the rearming and resupplying of Hamas, that's where it's all happened in recent years. I don't think there's any way you can get around that any longer. It's not coming by way of the Mediterranean. It's not coming over land from Israel. So it pretty much leaves Egypt. So it's about a 20-mile corridor that the Israelis are going to maintain control over. That's going to prevent the rearming and resupply of Hamas. On top of that, you're going to have, I think, because of what's been happening in with the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, you're not going to see the rearming of Hezbollah either, unless Iran somehow makes a new deal with the Al Qaeda rulers, the Turkish-backed Al Qaeda rulers in the Assad, or rather in Syria after the Assad regime. All of those things would seem right now to indicate that the Iranian axis, as we knew it, does not have the capability to rearm the way they once did. And so I think we may see sort of a lull in this kind of activity. It doesn't mean that peace is going to break out. Let's just be clear here. But I do think that it may take a bit longer for these groups to rearm, if they rearm at all. I mean, Hezbollah will have another go. Hamas, I'm not sure.
You mentioned the Netzarim corridor and also the Philadelphia corridor. So a big sticking point, an issue, apparently anyway, with previous ceasefire negotiations was the demand from Hamas that any part of the negotiations require that Israel withdraw entirely from Gaza. And Israel said themselves over a number of different occasions that they have no interest in a permanent presence. So what does that look like? Because you have to imagine that, having gone through this exercise and all this difficulty, the idea of packing up and leaving is not attractive, but the idea of a permanent occupation, both from, I think, the Israeli perspective, but also international narrative, I don't think that's tenable.
Look, it's not, but I'm going to just tell you flat out, I don't think the Israelis are going anywhere anytime soon. What they need to find is they need to find new political leadership in Gaza, and we just don't see it. I'm hard pressed to find anyone within the PLO that has the respect of the Israeli leadership right now. So the Palestinian Authority, that interim government that has not been performing wonderfully in the West Bank, I don't see them coming in. I don't see the Saudis or the Emiratis lining up, raising their hands, saying, "Hey, we want to spend time in Gaza. We want to spend billions of dollars in rebuilding Gaza." You're not seeing that either. So I think as long as we have that absence of leadership and real no vision for what comes next, I think the Israelis are going to have to stay there. And I got to tell you also, I don't think the Israelis are too unhappy about the idea of leaving Gaza, maybe in a little bit of a state of flux for a time, as a message to everyone. Here's what happens when you murder 1,200 Israelis. Here's what happens when you kidnap 250 plus Israelis. You don't just get, billions of dollars in blank checks from the international community. You just don't get to rebuild after 14 months. They're going to stay there. They're going to ensure that there's security, and they're going to rebuild things, I think, on their own terms. I think in perpetuity is not a good idea. I think that spending the time to make sure that they got the right ingredients and that Hamas has really been snuffed out after a hostage swap has been made, that does seem like something that would be realistic. You're not going to hear people cheering about it from Europe. You're not going to hear the UN saying this is a great thing. You're not going to hear the Arab world say that it's a great thing, but I think it's the reality.
Well, I agree with you 100%. Look, you're not going to hear anybody cheering about it, but I think it's going to be the opposite, right? You're going to hear a very proactive, aggressive response to anything that appears to be a mid to long-term occupation. And in reality, look, from an operational perspective, I think you've laid out, the reasons for maintaining a presence in the short term. I think it's absolutely operationally sound. But anything beyond that, we're just doing what we've always done in the Middle East. We're just kicking the can down the road, saying, all right, well, we've got a temporary peace, good for us. Let somebody else deal with it in the long term. So let's go back to that issue of political leadership, I mean, what, from your perspective, what is a longer term solution? What is that leadership in Gaza going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think a couple of points. One is it can't be Hamas. And there's talk right now of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority having some kind of technocratic leadership solution where they would together try to govern Gaza. I don't see the Israelis agreeing to it. They don't want to let Hamas in or let Hamas back in any demonstrable way, and they don't like the PA. I mean, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is corrupt. You got a guy who's, in his 80s, who's been in power since 2005. It's a disaster over there too. So, I think what the Israelis are looking for right now is, truly new leadership, clean leadership, um, a leader or a group of people that are, I think, interested in trying to build Gaza into something sustainable. Now, there are people who are talking about turning it into Singapore. Let's be honest. Gaza's not Singapore. I mean, you could turn it into something viable, but I don't think we should
Yeah.
exaggerate here. But I think really what we're looking for right now is leadership that's going to be endorsed by some of those pragmatic states in the Gulf. So whether it's the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Saudis, all right, some of Israel's better peace partners or better potential peace partners, having the endorsement of these countries, knowing that they are going to be, at the end of the day, the patrons of the people that inherit leadership in Gaza. I think that's really important for the Israelis. I think packaging this as part of a broader, extension of the Abraham Accords. We're watching, of course, Saudi Arabia. When the Trump administration comes in, they're going to start feeling the heat. They're going to, I mean, the Trump administration the last time around had them on the 5 yard line. They were ready to pull the trigger on a normalization deal. Trump lost, and as a result, the normalization progress really experienced some crazy setbacks. I think Biden really snatched defeat from the jaws of victory there. But I think with the Saudis coming, or with the Trump administration coming back, and the Saudis know that it's going to be on the table again, we may be able to create a new reality with Gaza in the mix. I think that shows some promise right now, but let's not get too giddy. There's a lot that needs to happen before that moment.
Yeah, I think I don't know that anybody's going to approach anything resembling giddy at this point. And I want to pick up on this after the break because uh, I'm a cynical person when it comes to developing any sort of long-term solutions out in the Middle East. Anybody who's been watching that area for decades, I think, might feel the same way. But I want to circle back to this after the break. Jonathan, if you'll stick around, we've got a quick break, and then we'll be back with Jonathan Schanzer. He's the executive director for the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Hey, Mike Baker here. Now, America, of course, just got done with a historical election. You may have heard something about that. Now, sure, there's going to be some change in the White House. There always is when you change administrations. But the fundamentals of the economy haven't changed. And here's the problem. The dollar is in decline, with the U.S. adding, get this, $100,000 in debt every second. I mean, look at your watch. Oh, there goes another 100,000. Oh, and another. And see, it just keeps ticking away. Meanwhile, BRICS nations have introduced the unit. That's what they're calling a new global currency, pegged 40% to gold and 60% to BRICS currencies, which could mark the beginning of a global monetary reset. So you ask yourself, okay, well, what do I do about all of this? Well, one suggestion is you should call the proud Americans of the Patriot Gold Group today before it's too late. Mention PDB, and you will always get best-in-class service from Patriots protecting Patriots. Patriot Gold Group has the no-fee-for-life IRA, where your IRA or 401k can be in physical gold and silver, and you may be eligible for the no-fee-for-life IRA on qualifying rollovers. Call 1-888-870-5457 for a free investor guide. And here's an important point. Patriot Gold Group is Consumer Affairs' top-rated gold IRA dealer for 7 years in a row. That's a lot of years in a row. Call 1-888-870-5457. Welcome back to the PDB Situation Report. Joining us again is Jonathan Schanzer. He's the executive director for the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And we are knee-deep in the ceasefire negotiations issue with Israel and Hamas. Jonathan, before the break, you were talking about the political leadership and what that could look like down the road. And I didn't want to interrupt you, but as you were talking about what is going to be required for a longer-term solution, I did want to jump in and say, well, okay, all of that being said, how optimistic are you that something like that is actually possible?
Look, I'm not optimistic in general. I mean, I think we've just watched a 14-month war play out in the Middle East. It's probably going to stretch into a 15th month before it ends, if it ends at all. And I would probably also expect chaos to continue in the West Bank. I'm not convinced that the Houthis are going to stop firing on Israel or on American warships in the Red Sea, even if a ceasefire deal is struck, even if the Iranians stop firing, even if Hezbollah stops firing. I'm not sure that this whole thing goes quiet. And with the Middle East, still on war footing, it's going to get even harder to find that political leadership that can step in. I do think, though, that at some point we are eventually going to see Mahmoud Abbas, or Abu Mazen as he's known, the president of the Palestinian Authority. He's getting up there in age. He's not well. At some point, he's going to leave the scene. That will give an opportunity to the Palestinians in the West Bank to select new leadership and to perhaps begin to rebuild anew. And that could include the Gaza Strip. And so I think that there are things that are coming down the pike when I'm not sure. Look, if you ask me, I think Donald Trump should come out early on in his new administration and say, hey, Abu Mazen, you've been in power since 2005. Get out. Your time's up, right? You've been in power now for far too long. You're almost 20 years into a 4-year term. Maybe it's time you step aside and let the Palestinians experience leadership that's going to be more effective. Do that and begin to have conversations with a new, pragmatic, I think forward-looking, moderate leader on the West Bank side of things. You may begin to see some breakthroughs. That would be ideal. Again, with encouragement coming from Saudi, from the Emirates, and from some of other peace partners that Israel actually trusts. I would say, by the way, Egypt and Jordan probably don't qualify.
Yeah, but looming over that is the Iranian regime. And it appears as if they still, even though they're weakened, there's no doubt about that, they don't seem to be shifting off their position that Israel shouldn't exist. So there can be discussions around what could happen in Gaza. But I guess my question for you now is, does anything change as long as the current Iranian regime and the IRGC are in place?
Look, the answer to that is obviously no. If the Iranian regime continues to agitate for the destruction of the state of Israel and makes it a key pillar of what the regime pushes for from a policy perspective, from a military perspective, we've got problems, right? We saw what those problems look like up close for 14 months, right? 7-front war being waged against Israel and the United States. Don't forget that, the U.S. was sustaining fire from Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria and Yemen throughout this entire process, and the Iranians were driving all of it, right? So we're going to have to solve this problem. Ultimately, I think that comes down to a policy embraced by the incoming Trump administration of regime change. Now, regime change is like a dirty word here in Washington. Here in the swamp, we don't talk about that anymore because, we did it in Iraq and Afghanistan, and people said, well, that failed, so we shouldn't try to do it again, right? That America's bad at it. Well, I think we've overlearned those lessons. I think we're now too timid when it comes to the real threats that America faces. And by the way, doesn't mean if we're in favor of regime change, we don't have to put boots on the ground. We don't have to start sacrificing, our blood and treasure in far-flung places. We can support the Iranian people, and we can support Iran's neighbors to help bring down this regime that has been a thorn in our side since 1979. But I want to actually.
So what does that look like Yeah, I'm sorry for
Greg, go
interrupting.
ahead.
And you may be getting ready to answer my question, but so what does that look like when you say regime change? And I agree. I've been around a long time, and I've seen my share of those activities. But what does that look like if it's not a kinetic war? In specifics, what would you do? How would you recommend if you were sitting down in the Oval Office saying, look, here's the key elements of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would argue that the vast majority of the Iranian people hate their regime. There are a ton of minorities that hate the regime, but there are also, they're Persians that hate the regime. They believe that their regime has wasted their oil revenue, that they have wasted military expenditures. And by the way, the repression that the regime has placed on its own people, this has run its course. And so we need to provide the people of Iran with cash, with intelligence, with communication systems, maybe even weapons as required to help them really develop a strategy and an execution that would bring down this regime that is thoroughly hated. I think that you've got Azerbaijan, you've got Saudi Arabia, you've got Israel, you've got a whole bunch of other countries in the region that also hate Iran. They hate this regime in Iran, right? They don't hate the Iranian people, but they do believe that the Islamic Republic is one of the greatest problems faced in the Middle East. You've got a whole country now in Syria. They're celebrating the ouster of Iran from that country. I think the Iraqis would probably benefit as well from expunging Iranian influence there. So what we need is a process of, removing this really rotten regime from across the Middle East, but it's got to start in Iran itself, where I think you have a population naturally inclined to help. So I think that's the conversation that needs to start sooner rather than later. And I think it's interesting because you got a president coming in who's been the target of assassination attempts by this regime. So he's going to be motivated to start to think about how we get rid of these bad actors. And of course, there's that history that we have dating back to Trump's maximum pressure campaign, the big sanctions that were being put on the regime. What we didn't do last time, we have an opportunity to do now, is to extend that to support to the Iranian people.
You mentioned Iraq, Jonathan. How significant is Iran's or the Iranian regime's influence in Iraq? And is there a potential that, given their loss of Syria, in a sense, that their focus shifts to developing further influence within Iraq, within the militias, and also within the Iraqi government?
Yeah, look, the Iranians already control Iraq to a large extent, and it was a huge mistake of ours to leave when we did in the way that we did because we left Iran in total control. It used to be that they, had primary control in the southern part of that country. That's the Shiite population there, and so it was sort of natural. But now, you go further north in Baghdad and even into parts of Kurdistan, and you're still going to see Iranian influence. Financial influence is clear. The central bank, I think, has just been hijacked by the Iranian regime. So, I'm deeply concerned there. I do think that the Shia militias, the PMUs as they're known, the Popular Mobilization Units that were based in Syria, they did leave. They melted away. I think a lot of them went to Iraq, and that's where they were going to reorganize. I think those Shia militias, by the way, may also continue the smuggling of Captagon, this addictive drug that has helped fund the Assad regime in the past. It's going to yield money to Hezbollah and to the regime itself. I can imagine that smuggling is going to continue by way of Iraq into Jordan. Jordan has been a popular place for the smuggling of that drug, but also weapons and cash bound for the West Bank. So yeah, I think we should expect Iraq to become some sort of a operational hub for the regime. I think, look, the good news is that it's now further away from Lebanon and it's further away from Israel, but the regime has not stopped trying to destabilize the Middle East. They're going to keep it going. And again, that's just one more reason why I think we need to push back against this regime and try to bring it down. And I think using the Iranian people is going to be the better way of doing this, the non-kinetic way, but we're going to need to give them real support, and it's going to need to be a whole of government effort, in my view, on the part of the Trump administration.
Yeah, I take your point. Look, I mean, I think if you can get the population to take it upon themselves to effect regime change, to drive the mullahs and the IRGC out, although the IRGC is just fully embedded in every aspect of the Iranian government and economy at this point. But again, here comes my cynical nature. I mean, we've been hoping for that for decades, right? We've been thinking that it would happen. We've been very poor at supporting it when there are glimmers of significant protest. But I take your point. That would be the ideal situation. I'm glad you raised the issue of Captagon. Estimates maybe a $10 billion trade, $2.5 billion going into Assad and his family's pockets as a result of the narco trafficking in Captagon. That's not going to go away. I think you raised a very important point. It's not as if there goes Assad. Oh, so we've solved the problem, right? Someone wants that revenue stream. And I would argue they've already infiltrated the past networks that were set up by Assad, and they're taking it over at this point. And my guess would be the Iranians aren't going to let that go anytime soon.
No, I think you're right. It's a huge lucrative business, and the smugglers on the Jordanian border, I'm sure, have already figured out how to talk to the the new Al Qaeda leadership that's taken over, Turkish-backed. And I'm sure the Turks would probably love to benefit from that drug trade. I think we should expect the Turks to try to take it over. But again, I think you're going to probably see some new smuggling networks from the Iraqi side of things, where the Iranians are going to try to exploit that process as well. So I think, Captagon continues, illicit financial flows continue, illicit weapons smuggling continues. This is the Middle East. We should expect these things, but I do think that the Iranian land bridge, as we used to call it, the Shiite crescent, has been disrupted. It's good news, but I think the one little bit of cold water I want to throw on this is that you now have, again, an Al Qaeda regime backed by Turkey, backed by Qatar, that's just taken over Syria. I don't think we should be celebrating that right now. I think a lot of people are saying, "Hey, Assad's gone. This is great, big victory." This is, Alien versus Predator. You got one bad actor winning against another, and we're going to have to deal with them too. So I think some interesting challenges ahead that I think have yet to be grappled with by the lame duck outgoing Biden administration. They seem like bystanders right now. The hope here is, of course, that the Trump team are taking a good hard look at the new rulers of Syria, their patrons, in Ankara and Doha, and trying to figure out how to make sure that they can be contained. Because Al Qaeda, we all should remember, not a good actor. And we could even see jailbreaks by ISIS, up in the north in the Kurdish areas. That could make things even more chaotic. This is one to watch right now, far from stable in Syria.
Yeah, it reminds me very much of the early days in Iraq. There was this euphoria with the fall of Saddam Hussein, and it didn't take very long. It was a blink of an eye, and we all stood around and watched it just descend into chaos and sectarian violence. So I think you're right. We need to dampen down while still being, proactive and optimistic. And I think you do an amazing job of that. I don't know that I've talked to anybody recently, Jonathan, that walks that line better between cynicism and optimism. And so I give you a lot of credit. But Jonathan Schanzer, Executive Director for the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, this has been delightful. I don't use the word delightful very often, but I do hope you'll come back, because we've got a lot of ground left to cover.
It'd be my pleasure. Anytime.
All right. Coming up next, the war in Ukraine, believe it or not, is about to enter its third year, with North Korean troops now taking casualties on Russian soil. Open source intelligence analyst Ryan McBeth will join us to break down the biggest developments of 2024 and what we might expect in 2025. Stay with us. Hey, Mike Baker here. Look, if you're tired of the same old coffee from those mega corporations, and I think you know the ones I'm talking about, pushing their woke agendas, which they do, well, listen up. It's time to take a stand and support a brand that truly embodies American values. And of course, I'm talking about Blackout Coffee. Look, they stand with hardworking Americans who believe in family, in faith, and in freedom. They roast some of the most incredible coffee you'll ever taste. That is the truth. Using only premium grade beans, roasted and shipped to you, get this, within 48 hours, right? The beans are sitting in the roaster, and before you know it, there they are in your mug. For the cold brew fans, Blackout Coffee is now also excited to announce the launch of their 2 new ready-to-drink cold brew coffee latte options. Don't settle for less. Make the switch to Blackout Coffee. Head over to blackoutcoffee.com/PDB and use the code, here comes the code, PDB, for 20% off your first order. That's blackoutcoffee.com/PDB, and the code, of course, is PDB. Join the movement and taste the difference. Remember, with every sip, you're supporting a brand that stands for America. And as we say around these parts, be awake, not woke. Welcome back to the PDB Situation Report. As 2025 approaches, you may have heard that it's right around the corner, the war in Ukraine is set to enter its 3rd year. Now, the past 12 months have seen little dramatic movement along the front lines. Back and forth, it's like a World War I episode. But Russia continues its slow and grinding offensive, inching forward in some key areas. One of the most significant developments of 2024 has been the arrival, bizarrely, of North Korean ground troops fighting alongside Russian forces. In recent days, reports indicate that these troops have begun to take casualties during clashes with Ukrainian forces in Russia's Kursk province. Today, we're going to take a look back at this year's key developments and what they mean for the conflict moving forward. Joining me for this discussion is open source intelligence analyst and very good friend of the show, Ryan McBeth. You can find more of Ryan's insights at ryanmcbeth.substack.com or on his most excellent YouTube channel, and you should be watching that, at Ryan McBeth Programming. Ryan, thanks again for being willing to make a return appearance yet again on the Situation Report.
It's always a pleasure.
Excellent. Hey, all right, let's do it. Let's do a year in review for Ukraine and Russia for 2024. Give me your thoughts.
Oh, boy. When the whole war started, the design cycles for drones were every 6 to 8 months. They had like a new kind of drone. And now we're seeing the design cycles of six to 8 weeks. It's really amazing what both sides have done with drone technology. It just recently, with Russia inventing these FPV drones that spool wire out, so they're essentially wire-guided drones that can't be jammed. It's also pretty amazing that Ukraine has developed some of its own ballistic and cruise missiles during wartime, which is it's a pretty heavy lift, to design something like that, especially during a war when you're also trying to get beans and bullets to the front. The Kursk incursion essentially proved that Russia's nuclear threats are essentially nothing. If Russia was going to use a nuclear weapon, dropping it right on troops entering the Kursk offensive, because there's one road going in and out of Kursk, that would have been an ideal place to use a nuclear weapon, would have stopped the advance cold just like that, and they did not do that. So it's questionable as to whether or not Russia will even use nuclear weapons. It's actually pretty questionable as to whether their nuclear weapons work all that well after years of failed maintenance. One of the things that I pointed out is that in 2021, the U.S. spent $50 billion on maintaining our nuclear stockpile, and Russia spent about $66 billion on their entire army. So we have a rough number of warheads, so take a wild guess whose warheads are probably in better condition. So that's pretty much the situation. We have a front that is mostly stabilized, although the Ukrainians are slowly losing ground. They're going to have to close that loop somehow. But if you take a look at some sources, especially Covert Cabal, who essentially buys satellite footage and then counts Russian tanks, Russia will probably be out of tanks by 2026 and other armored vehicles. And that's going to be a big problem when you can only manufacture about 50 tanks a month.
All right, so all of that, right? I think that's encapsulating a lot of stuff, right? And then stuff is a technical term here. What would you say is the the most significant development of 2024 when it comes to this conflict?
Probably the most significant development is the advent of North Korean troops inside Russia. Russia has always had this deal with their elites. The elites have said, do whatever you want, just don't touch our boys. So Russia cannot do another general mobilization, or Putin will end up hanging upside down outside a gas station like Mussolini. And by bringing in North Korean troops, Russia has this next source of troops so that it can put into the fight, or at least perform rear line duties like guard depots or just do transportation, things like that. So you might have an unending source of men, although North Korea's price for giving out those troops might slowly rise and rise. We want more oil, we want more tech, we want more this, we want more that. So there will always be a cost to those North Korean troops.
What do you hear about the integration, the success of that, of the North Korean troops into Russian military operations?
Seems like it's going pretty bad. There are extreme communication problems. There are North Korean troops who they have very difficult time understanding what the Russians want them to do, and then once they do it, they don't know how to act. And look, the Russian army that waltzed into Ukraine, I should say that stumbled into Ukraine in 2022, is not the same Russian army we have now. If you survived and you learned, you do have a measure of skill. And so you're coming into that as seasoned veterans. You may be combat weary, but you also have combat experience. Whereas the North Koreans haven't fought a war essentially since 1953. So they have no experience, no idea what to expect. I can imagine there's some North Korean soldiers who didn't even know that drones existed. And now you have first-person view drones slamming into them. It must be an incredible shock, like someone who's been on a lifeboat for years and they come home and all of a sudden there's new technology and such. It must be incredible to be a North Korean soldier to be thrown into this meat grinder.
Yeah, well, not only did they not know that drones existed, they probably didn't know that porn on the internet existed. So, yeah.
That's certainly possible.
Yeah, it's a grand awakening for the entire North Korean contingent that's been shipped out there to the meat grinder. Look, I guess you mentioned the problem that Putin's got with his own personnel, with mobilizing again, with a big conscription. But at a certain point, right, you can't. I mean, the concept is, okay, I can fill some gaps with this supply of North Korean troops, but he can't build an effective military, right, when there is this massive cultural and language and experience gap. So at some point, do you think he's got a legitimate manpower problem?
He absolutely does. Now, this is starting to look a lot like Vietnam, where every president rolled in and was like, I'm going to fix Vietnam. And they went, oh, crap, we can't fix Vietnam. And now Russia's in this weird state where they can't really raise more troops. They're probably going to have to pay the North Koreans a heck of a lot more money to get more troops from them. And also, their economy is in this weird wartime economy where Russia literally can't win. And by can't win, I don't mean they physically don't have the ability to win. They might have the ability to win, as in military victory, but if they do that, their economy collapses. They have this wartime economy that is overheating right now. Everybody is either in the army or they're working at a munitions plant or building vehicles. So the second this war ends, now you have all these people who are jobless and know how to use a gun. What are they going to do? What happens when that kind of thing happens? Well, you get the Ceausescu special, right? So they're in this weird situation where they can't stop the war. They can't win the war. They can't agree to a peace agreement because their economy will suddenly grind to a halt. So this is the most logical choice, is to actually keep the war going, as crazy as that sounds.
Yeah. To what degree can you talk about the importance of outside economic support I mean, there's two parts to this. Obviously, there's the economic support. There's the actual provision of munitions and goods that they've been getting from North Korea or Iran. But how important has that been? Whether it's China, whether it's North Korea, whether it's Iran, how important has that outside help been to Putin and his economy in keeping this war effort going?
It's extremely important, mainly because Russia has a huge machine tools problem. It's something that not a lot of people talk about. Russia doesn't really manufacture advanced machine tools, and they get a lot of their machine tools from the West. Well, that's been cut off since 2022. So now they have this choice. We have machine tools. Do we use these machine tools to manufacture weapons? Do we use them to manufacture parts for our oil rigs, which we need to sell oil in order to get money to pay our troops? Or do we use these machine tools to manufacture the bogies, the wheels that go under trains? So they have this horrible choice. And so if they can import weapons from Iran, import weapons from North Korea, I'm not sure any weapons are imported from China. I believe only tech. But if they can import that stuff, that takes some of the pressure off the machine tools that are needed to make other things.
Mm-hmm. Have you heard anything about joint manufacturing capability? There's been some reporting about a drone manufacturing facility in China that was established, maybe retooled, to support Russia's war effort.
I actually haven't heard anything about a drone manufacturing facility in China. I know a special economic zone was set up where Russia is building Iranian Shahed 135 drones inside Russia using, I believe, African labor. Like they've imported these people from Africa to go and work. I haven't heard anything about China, though, although that's a tough one because from what I understand, China doesn't mind buying Russian oil or selling the microchips in the form of microwave ovens that they can then disassemble. But I don't believe China has actually gone the direct route of selling weapons. That might be for a few reasons. One is that they might not want to anger the United States, who might throw tariffs on goods for them exporting actual physical weapons. And the other is that, China's set a goal to invade Taiwan by 2027. So they need all the weapons they can get for that kind of thing. And there's only two times a year you can do it. You can do it in October, you can do it in April. That's when the Strait of Taiwan's sea state is low. So, that date is coming up, tick-tock. So I think we're looking at October 2027 as a date when China might try to make a move on Taiwan militarily, and they need all the stuff they can get in order to do that.
Ooh, we got, ladies and gentlemen, that's some breaking news. By 2027, good God.
That's when Z has said.
Right now, people, you know what people are doing right now? People are they're just ducking under their school desks right now. We've taken everybody back to the Cold War. Ryan, listen, we've got terrific sponsors. We're going to hear from a few of them. When we come back with Ryan McBeth, we're going to see if he can fit one more challenge coin back there on the shelf in his office. We have to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the PDB Situation Report. We're joined again by Ryan McBeth. You can check him out at ryanmcbeth.substack.com or, and this is what you should be doing, going to his YouTube channel at Ryan McBeth Programming. Ryan, let's talk about Syria. Something happened out there, but let's talk about it in context of Russia. How significant is the fall of Assad's regime in Syria on Russia?
So it's good and bad. Russia used Syria as a staging base where they could they have an airport there, and they have a port, like a port for ships. And they needed that base because Russian ships aren't very good. And in order to go from place to place, they have to refuel. So that one particular base allowed them to refuel and have an actual base in the Mediterranean where they could conduct operations. Now, the other reason that Russia was in Syria was that it was an excellent way to farm XP. If you wanted to train your pilots in how to do precision bombing, or in some cases not so precision bombing, you could do that in Syria, and you could gain that experience. Their air controllers get experience, their special forces get experience fighting ISIS or fighting elements of the resistance. And it's one of those things where everybody wins except for the resistance. The Russians get a little war that they can blood their soldiers on and get some training on their soldiers. But when you think about it, Russia has all this equipment in Syria, and that could probably be used in Ukraine. So I think kind of toward the end, Russia was looking at Syria as a headache. It'd be nice to get rid of this thing. I mean, yeah, we need the base, but it'd be nice if we could give this thing back so we can move all this equipment over to Russia.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because, I mean, you go back to 2015, 2016, Russia provided significant, critical military support to Assad at that point in time to beat back the rebels and the protests that they were experiencing. And it looks like this time around, Putin almost just threw his hands up and said, sorry, bud, we can't help you.
You're absolutely correct. And I think Russia saw where things were falling in Syria. And plus, kind of like Vietnam, when we had the South Vietnamese, you had a dictator. There was massive corruption in Bashar al-Assad's army, to the point where soldiers would pay their commanders not to show up. Like, here's a couple of Syrian pounds. I'm going to go work my civilian job. You just say I was at roll call every day. And it's very difficult to run an army like that when you have ghost soldiers who don't actually exist in the ranks.
Yeah, and a decent portion of that military was basically used to support the narco trafficking by the Assad regime that was taking place.
That's correct.
And unfortunately now is going to be picked up by someone else. Now, my intel sources tell me that you've got a theory related to the fall of Syria. What is that?
I do. It's kind of like dominoes here. I think it goes back to the New York Times. And I've told Israelis about this, and they say, "Oh, Ryan, you're crazy," But I believe that this could be a good theory. Essentially, on October 17th, 2023, the New York Times claimed that Israel bombed the Ali Arabiya hospital. And actually, it was an Islamic State missile that landed short. But again, it's the New York Times. They don't tend to fact check stuff. And so they said, oh, Israel bombed this place. That article was up for 6 hours. And that was when the world left the side of Israel. Israel lost the information war that day when the New York Times, when they kind of showed their anti-Semitic face. And after that, Israel said, you know what? We're not going to win the information war. We're not going to run around randomly killing people, but we're going to go hard on Hezbollah because it's not like the world cares. We lost the New York Times. We lost the public. We're just going to go hard. And so they went in hard on Hamas. Once they attrited Hamas to a certain level, they said, we're going to go in hard on Hezbollah. Once they went in hard on Hezbollah, Hezbollah actually had operators, genuine, honest to God, special forces inside of Syria. They were farming XP there, fighting against ISIS, Daesh, and fighting against the rebels. So what does Hezbollah do? They pull those guys back into Lebanon because they have to fight the Israelis. Now Assad has one less brigade of troops that can be reliable. And I strongly believe that HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the organization that essentially took over Syria in 10 days, I believe they said, you know what, this is our opportunity. There's a reason why they invaded the day. They attacked Aleppo the day that a ceasefire was signed between Hezbollah and Israel. They knew that Hezbollah wasn't coming back. All right, that's one less brigade we got to worry about. We have 50 days to take all of Syria before President Trump gets in office, and there's a new sheriff in town. And that's exactly what they did. So I think it all goes back to the New York Times and a fake news story.
Have you heard from the New York Times? Have they called to corroborate your theory?
I have not. And what's interesting is that about last year, I actually did a story on the New York Times. Like, why do they always consistently get military stories wrong? And after my research, what I found was that they only have 8 people on staff who had served in the military. 8. When they do articles about
let's just repeat that. Let's repeat that. So the entire New York Times staff, according to your research, they have only 8 individuals who had any military experience.
That's correct. And that was as of last year, 2023, around October 2023. That's when I did my video on them. I have a feeling they haven't increased their personnel any, and some of those personnel weren't reporters. They were like audio engineers, janitors, that kind of thing. And the way to get it right is to hire good people. If you're going to have a person report on medicine, might want to be a doctor, maybe a PA, or maybe a degree in hospital, clinical, whatever. So if you're going to write articles about the military, it would help if some of your people had some military experience, and they don't.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. I was just out in the Middle East for the past couple of weeks, and oddly enough, leading up to and then during the overthrow of the Assad regime, and watching some of the war correspondents or the journalists from a variety of networks trying to cover this thing, kind of shifted anywhere between pathetic and laughable in terms of their understanding of what was going on. But they all knew that this was in a moment. It was basically, look at me, I'm a war correspondent. But the level of information was fairly sad, and I think it's in part because of that, right? Just because you happen to be in a location, you've got a microphone, it doesn't mean that you understand what the hell is happening around you. Let's, if we could, I'm going to shift gears, Ryan.
Sure.
I can't think of a better person to ask this question. The drones over the east coast of the United States. Are they hobbyists? Are they Chinese regime drones? Do they belong to aliens? What's the actual answer here?
That's actually a good question. I honestly believe that originally, so let's say what they aren't. They're not drones coming from offshore from an Iranian mothership. If the Coast Guard had heard about that, look, the Coast Guard goes after narco submarines. If they manage to capture an Iranian mothership launching drones, they'd never have to buy a beer again, right? So it's not an Iranian mothership launching drones. Typically, if you were trying to be sneaky and surveil military bases, you wouldn't have your lights on, right? You wouldn't have your navigation lights on. So we can probably say it's not that. What I believe is that most likely these drones were part of a red team kind of exercise. Only people who needed to know about the exercise knew about the exercise, because that's how you run a red team, right? And then after the exercise, everything became a drone. The helicopters became drones, low-flying aircraft became drones, everything became a drone. And some of this is compounded by the fact that people really don't know what the laws are for drones. It is perfectly legal to fly at night as long as you have your lights on. And the FAA considers drones to fall under the same rule as manned aircraft. So you can't actually shoot them down, right? So there's a lot of misunderstanding in the public about the laws and what was going on.
Now, but what about I agree with you. I think a number of these sightings related to whatever the reason was, red teaming or just, U.S. government or military testing new technologies or capabilities. But what about the drone incursions over a variety of U.S. Classified sites, military facilities in particular? I think one thing that is disturbing to the general public is that there's not protocol in place for the military or for the government to deal with incursions over sensitive airspace, right?
You're right.
And so the public's just watching this and going, well, how do you possibly let these things just fly around over our facilities and you don't know, or you're at least saying that you don't know who they belong to?
You're absolutely right. Some of our laws might need to be changed because, like I said, the FAA treats drones like they're manned aircraft. So you can't just go around shooting them down. And you also can't jam them because the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, does not allow civilians to use jammers. This would mean civilian police as well. So the police can't use jammers because they interfere with signals. The FCC bans them. Can't have jammers. The military can use jammers, but I guarantee you the second you turn that jammer on, everyone's going to complain about how their GPS isn't working near the military base or how their cable's out or whatever signal isn't working correctly. Seriously, we need a way to deal with this, and right now our tools are very limited because our laws are kind of very 2006 when it comes to these kinds of drones. And I can understand why people would be frightened about these incursions, but legally, there's not a lot we can do because we can't shoot them down and we can't jam them. All we can do is put up a sign saying no drone zone, try to find the guy who's actually controlling those drones. And with the way the internet works or satellite communication or even autonomous drones, that person could be anywhere or the drone could be totally autonomous and fly from place to place without any outside signal.
Well, but okay, I guess, to play devil's advocate, I get that when you're talking about just drones flying over, any old spot. Yeah. But when you're talking about, like, over this past weekend, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio had to shut down its airspace temporarily because of drone incursions, right? Yeah. It's an air base. It houses some, fairly significant military elements. Yeah. You would think, or you would like to think, that the U.S. government and military are switched on enough, and drones didn't just show up yesterday, right? So drone technology has been around for some time. But you would think that when you're talking about an incursion over a classified or secure or sensitive site, that the game changes and you just remove the threat and then deal with it later on. And perhaps if it's a hobbyist, then okay, maybe that hobbyist learns not to do that crap later on. Am I missing something?
No, I think you're absolutely correct. It's just the legal tools in their toolkit may be limited. Also, look, if commanders tend to be fairly risk-averse people, so they're doing a risk assessment and they're going, all right, if I shoot this drone down, first of all, they have to have equipment to either degrade or destroy the drone in the first place. That equipment might not necessarily be accessible.
But we have that technology.
Have it.
We have the ability.
But do you have it on you? That's the question, right? Like, we might have an anti-drone gun.
I do. I have it on me right now. I actually have that equipment with me right now.
Well,
because, God damn it, I'm going to take. Oh, I'm sorry. I shouldn't be swearing on the Situation Report. But next drone I see it's it. Bob's your uncle. Anyway, I'm sorry for interrupting. Go ahead, Ryan.
No, absolutely. Yeah, look, these anti-drone guns, essentially you point them at the drone and then you pull the trigger and it sends a signal toward that drone and it sends the shutdown code of every possible drone in the inventory. That's why you have to refresh, update the software on those drone guns every once in a while because new shutdown codes come, right? So in order to do that, you have to have the shutdown, or you have to have those weapons, those anti-drone guns, accessible. That's one thing. Now, if that drone is autonomous, you can't shut it down by pointing an anti-drone gun at it, right? Because it's not receiving any signals. It's just using GPS or it's using terrain matching in order to navigate. So if you do something like that, all right, maybe you could degrade GPS at the airport, but who's going to complain about that? Everybody around the airport and the aircraft that are using GPS to land. That's another issue you have. Now, you could also shoot them down, and now the question is, all right, let's say we put an MSHORAD system at an airfield to shoot down drones. Are you going to be responsible when that rocket overshoots that drone and lands in a neighborhood by Wright-Patterson? Because usually it's not a good idea to fire live ordnance around homes, right? So it's a tough problem. A solution.
No, I get it. You don't want to launch a rocket into Mabel's living room while she's watching Wheel of Fortune. But not to pick on people named Mabel. I don't know where the hell I came up with Mabel. No, it is a complex issue, but I think my point is I suppose that I'm just expressing the frustration I hear from a lot of people who ask me the question of, well, how can the government not have a protocol in place already, technology in place already for their most sensitive sites, because this has been going on for some time. Ryan, that is a conversation we're going to have to pick up the next time, and I hope there is a next time. But listen, as always, man, I really, really appreciate your insight, your information, and the background there in your office. So,
Thank you
Ryan
so much for
McBeth,
inviting me
thank
on.
you.
Always a pleasure.
Oh, man, thank you. Ryan McBeth, thank you. And as always, I hope when we call, Ryan picks up the phone again. Listen, that's all the time we have for the PDB Situation Report. I know, don't look so sad. If you have any questions or comments, or even humorous anecdotes, please, or even limericks. I don't know if people do limericks anymore. Reach out to me at pdb@thefirsttv.com, because you know what we do. We take some of those questions and some of those comments every month, and we smash them together into what we call the Ask Me Anything episodes, where we highlight some of your questions and your comments. So keep those cards and letters coming, please. And to listen to the podcast of the show ad-free, yeah, it's simple. Become a premium member of the President's Daily Brief by visiting pdbpremium.com. See, I told you it was simple. I'm Mike Baker. And until next time, you know the drill. Stay informed, stay safe, stay cool.